Thanks so much for joining us. We're here to present the report of the FAS International Study Group on North Korea policy. I'll just sort of give a brief introduction, talk through generally the process behind the report, and sort of give a general overview of the findings, and ask Mira and Ankit to drill down a little more deeply into security matters and some other specific recommendations. The process behind the report started a little more than a year ago when Andrea Berger, my co-author, and I started to think through the implications of North Korea testing an ICBM. We started to warn sort of privately that North Korea was likely to test an ICBM sooner than expected, and came to be convinced that it really did have some serious implications for US and allied policy, that it wasn't good enough to sort of carry on as business as usual, but there were substantial adjustments to be made in a range of allied policies with respect to North Korea. The study group was composed about a year ago of 12 other, mostly younger experts, but from a range of disciplines. So there's a doctor, Dr. Key Park, economists, human rights activists, and scholars, some security minds, and really we sort of came together on the goal of, with the charge of developing a policy towards a nuclear-armed North Korea for the foreseeable future. There's a growing expert consensus that North Korea is simply not likely to disarm on acceptable terms in the foreseeable future. And indeed, the study group came to the conclusion fairly early on that there's no combination of military, economic, or diplomatic pressure that can disarm North Korea on acceptable terms. And so what does that mean for US and allied policy? There's a range of challenges that poses. How do you deter a nuclear-armed North Korea that's becoming increasingly capable, not only in the nuclear domain, but also in a range of subconventional domains like cyber, like conventional forces, special operations forces? What are sanctions for if North Korea is not going to disarm immediately? If we can no longer trust in our ability to put sufficient economic pressure on the regime to force them to make this choice to disarm, then what are the objectives of sanctions policy, and should it be adjusted? How do we provide for the welfare of North Korean citizens if we're really in this for the long run and it's no longer worth sort of pushing those kinds of concerns into the back seat while we negotiate on nuclear disarmament? So we brought together this group of scholars and experts from the United States, Canada, South Korea, Japan, from Europe, to talk through from the start, what does a coordinated allied policy look like? And we quickly realized that when you do away with this assumption of immediate disarmament, there's some pretty dramatic implications for US and allied policy. We realized that there's a range of US policies that are neglecting a range of threats from North Korea, but also in some cases exacerbating those concerns. So the exclusive focus on immediate disarmament has pushed to, has sort of, in some ways, it's backing North Korea into a corner. US officials regularly dismiss or discount North Korea's nuclear forces, their second strike capability, their ability to threaten the continental United States. And as long as we do so, we create a strong incentive for North Korea to expand its arsenal, to diversify it, to demonstrate these capabilities. And at the same time, ongoing negotiations have not so far imposed any real restrictions on those capabilities. At the same time, North Korea is evolving internally. Their markets are cropping up all over North Korean society. They are increasingly relying on markets for food. The public distribution system is more or less collapsing, for personal goods, for their own personal welfare. And as they marketize, the regime has been permitted the space and has succeeded to a large extent in imbuing new market institutions with really sort of destructive norms, corruption, expropriation by the regime, sexual discrimination and violence against North Korean female entrepreneurs who disproportionately make up a large section of North Korean market activity. At the same time, new personal technologies like DVD players, personal computers, cell phones, the regime has found ways to embed firmware and other surveillance technologies in these devices to surveil and control and repress their population. And in terms of humanitarian affairs, they continue to use hunger and privation as means of depriving and repressing their own population. So the group came to the conclusion that if trends are left unaddressed, if current trends continue, North Korea will expand its ability to aggress against the United States and its allies, fund its activities through illicit international activity and economic development, and to repress its population. The concern here is that every week that goes by, every month that goes by, in which we focus exclusively on disarmament, which is an unrealistic expectation, to the detriment of all of these other interests and concerns, we're really falling behind the curve. So what the group concluded was it's vital that we not only manage this broader range of threats from North Korea, but seek to shape the transformation, shape the evolution of the regime over time, and its security relationship with its neighbors and with the United States to provide a firmer basis, a more stable basis for security and prosperity in Northeast Asia. And so we have a couple of sort of top-line recommendations and proposals that we'd like to talk through with you. I think I'll turn to you, Mira, to talk through how you're thinking about and how the group thought about arms control and security in the context of a nuclear-armed North Korea, and specifically this device of a threshold agreement.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you to the Korea Society for having us, and to Adam for his really fearless leadership in this very innovative group that he brought together. It was quite a prescient endeavor by Adam and his co-director, and we were both lucky to be a part of it. I'm going to talk today a little bit about how the group thought about defining security in a world in which North Korea retains its nuclear and missile capability. And then I know that Ankit will embroider and have a lot to add on the security front as well. As we started to mull through the implications of the fact that we all believed that North Korea would retain a deliverable nuclear weapons capability for quite a long time, we asked ourselves what it meant to have security, regional security, global security in that world. And the way that we defined it from the outset really was to think about security in terms of stability. What would be a set of outcomes that wouldn't necessarily be pleasant or ideal, that might take a lot of work, but that would not promote escalation, would reduce the risk of war, and would generally allow both the people on the Korean Peninsula, the region of Asia, and the world to live in relative peace, despite the fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons. Again, Adam has spoken to the fact that this unrealistic emphasis on rapid disarmament has caused us to neglect other priorities. So the question for us was, short of full disarmament, how could we bring that stability about with lesser types of agreements, similar, seemingly lower hanging fruit, but things that would nonetheless bring some measure of peace and stability to the Korean Peninsula? So the innovation that the group sort of coalesced around was the idea that there could be actually a variety of forms of agreement with North Korea, whereby Pyongyang would make some, over time, perhaps significant concessions with respect to its nuclear and missile programs, while the United States and its allies and partners would make concomitant concessions that were proportional, but only directly proportional to what Pyongyang was willing to yield. The idea, which we called the threshold agreement, was that there should be some set of possible negotiations that should prevent the parties from facing down unnecessary military escalation, risks of accidental and inadvertent escalation, should impose some verifiable limits on North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities, should prohibit destabilizing practices like atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons or missile overflights, let's say of Japan, and should disincentivize destabilizing practices like adopting dangerous command and control procedures. Moreover, one of the other things that we hope to fall under some form of threshold agreement is that North Korea should not be able to proliferate its illicit capabilities. So the idea of this threshold agreement as a concept is that the United States and its partners should make some form of agreement an immediate objective of diplomacy. That is, rather than, let's say, going to summits on the other side of the world and going big and insisting that full disarmament is the only deal that we can settle for, that actually there are a number of incremental steps that could start relatively small and could be expanded over time to an increasingly meaningful set of agreements that would reduce the dangers on the Korean Peninsula. As an example, an opening salvo could be one in which North Korea formally agreed to limit certain types of testing. That is to say, what it has done by default for the last year and a half or so, it could put on paper. Likewise, it could create plans and agree to plans to disable existing reactors without necessarily touching its existing stockpile of weapons. And in exchange, the United States and its allies and partners could offer up concessions that were similarly meaningful. So perhaps agreeing to the removal of certain types of non-military sanctions that would improve the welfare of the North Korean people. Now, we actually see in this idea of a threshold agreement a ton of possibility. The fact that there are many different levels of types of concessions that North Korea could make between nothing, the status quo, where we're both sort of operating without any sort of concession to one another, and full disarmament. And indeed, we categorize the possible types of deals into low and medium and high value concessions. A low value concession might be something like an agreement to hand over some information about a certain set of military practices. A medium value concession might be a dismantlement of a facility that was considered perhaps important, but not an incredibly high value facility. Whereas a high value concession would be the complete and verified dismantlement of a nuclear, a fissile material production facility, or the dismantlement of a certain type of missile that the parties agreed to prioritize. So point being that in exchange for each one of these levels of concessions, the United States and its allies and partners could offer up concessions of their own. The basic idea of this threshold agreement and the possibilities that encompasses is that stability should be the objective of negotiations, and that if we define our security expectations, our security goals with respect to North Korea, in terms of these smaller achievable agreements, we can over time shape a status quo that when perturbed, that when disrupted by perhaps some kind of illicit activity on the North Korean side, some type of regional disturbance, the situation returns to the status quo as opposed to escalating. That is the definition of stability that we are working with. But very important is that this threshold agreement lead to some meaningful version of arms control. The idea here is that by making incremental concessions, by entering first at a lower level and perhaps building a pattern of cooperation over time, we can establish what has not been established in the last several years of diplomacy or lack of diplomacy with North Korea, which is meaningful concessions below the full disarmament threshold that improve peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. And the group's thinking is that arms control is quite important, but is fundamentally going to be a difficult point of equilibrium to achieve for both sides. Hence why this threshold agreement exists as a concept that can encompass any number of different types of agreements. The reason for that is that for us to achieve stability on the Korean Peninsula, there is a sort of bizarre perceptual threshold that you have to achieve from both the American perspective, the North Korean perspective, and the perspective of other parties involved. The North Koreans, to believe they are living in a stable world, must believe that their current levels of nuclear and missile capabilities are sufficient to deter. That is to say, sufficient to deter a first strike by the United States, such that those capabilities could survive and plausibly cause a threat to us or to the region. This sounds like a gruesome sort of equilibrium point to have located, but that's actually how we measure deterrence. If North Korea has an incentive to use its weapons first, then the situation is not stable, and we can't think of ourselves as having reached an equilibrium. But by using a concept like a threshold agreement and building it out over time, we can move towards a form of arms control, which is frankly unprecedented in the history of arms control. That is, between states that are abiding by the nuclear nonproliferation regime and a state that has proliferated illegally and in violation of it. Of course, all nuclear arms control basically to date has basically been between the United States and the Soviet Union, or with Russia. So this form of thinking about arms control as a series of successive agreements that could be built out over time is, I think, one of the unique contributions of this report. And again, understanding that this requires a certain level of stability on the North Korean side, that fundamentally the North Koreans must believe that their capabilities are safe, but then over time that we can increase the scope of the cooperative agreements that we conclude with them, mean that the situation has a possibility of becoming incrementally more stable over time. And with that, I will turn it over to, shall I turn it over to Ankit? Or
Yeah,
okay.
thanks so much. So, Ankit, I wanted to ask you, Mira walked us through the reasoning of the group about the goals and the principles behind a threshold agreement. Could you talk us through, one of those principles is preventing the unlimited expansion of the North Korean arsenal. How much worse could it get? What more could they build? And then sort of talk us through the other thing that the group that I found so fascinating sort of supported was this ongoing program of conventional arms control. So can you sort of talk us through the status of the North Korean arsenal and its, where it stands in its evolution, and what can we do to confront and limit this broader range of threats from North Korea?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. So in 2017, North Korea became the first country in 46 years to acquire an intercontinental range ballistic missile striking the United States. And I say that as a country being overtly adversarial to the United States. So what happened 46 years ago? China perfected or first tested the DF-5 ICBM, which was China's first true capability. So we talk about North Korea as being the only state to have withdrawn from the NPT and broken out as a nuclear state, and that presents unique challenges to the nonproliferation regime. But not only is that true, it's also the only state to exist outside of the NPT with nuclear weapons that is overtly adversarial to the United States. So that determines the way that Washington and its allies, primarily Seoul and Tokyo in the region, need to think about the North Korean proliferation challenge and also the nuclear threat posed by Pyongyang. So at the center of the group's thinking about arms control is the idea of qualitatively and quantitatively constraining North Korea's nuclear arsenal. The qualitative aspect was what Kim Jong-un in November 2017 basically signaled that he was satisfied with when he declared the country's deterrent to be completed after the first successful flight test of the Hwasong-15 intercontinental range ballistic missile, North Korea's largest and most capable missile. He was signaling that North Korea had qualitatively attained the set of things that it needed to successfully deter the United States. It had the capability to strike as far as the United States East Coast, probably as far as Florida, with a large-sized nuclear payload, a thermonuclear weapon. But none of this means that North Korea's nuclear development is completed. In January 2018, right before the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics charm offensive began and our current bout of diplomacy kicked off, Kim Jong-un's New Year's Day address emphasized the need to quantitatively build out the arsenal now. Now that the qualitative aspect had been completed, North Korea, like any other nuclear state, would begin building out its nuclear forces to be deployed in large numbers. And so Kim directly on January 1st, 2018, called for the munitions industry and the nuclear weapons complex to begin manufacturing warheads and ballistic missiles at mass scale. And of course, that's the last we really saw or heard of North Korea's nuclear arsenal in the public. The tests stopped. North Korea did one parade on February 8th, 2018, the day before the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, actually. And then on September 9th, the 70th anniversary of the country's founding, there was a military parade in Kim Il-sung Square, but we saw no nuclear-capable systems. The nuclear weapons had been kept under the radar as the diplomacy carried forward, but make no mistake, a quantitative expansion was continuing behind the scene. And until the day that we arrive at an agreement like the one that we propose or any other range of agreements, that quantitative expansion will continue to the point at which North Korea is satisfied that it has a sufficiently large nuclear force to deter the United States. And it's aware that we're modernizing our nuclear arsenal here in the United States, and allied developments are underway in South Korea and Japan, and it will continue to shape and evolve its nuclear forces as long as it needs to be sure of the fact that it can deter the United States and its allies. So the incentives to then impose some kind of arms control arrangement where we can qualitatively and quantitatively constrain North Korea become all the more urgent. So on the qualitative side, there is a lot more that can be done. So if this process that we're in right now, where as far as we know, North Korea's qualitative advancement has been mostly restricted. We haven't seen new kinds of nuclear tests. For example, let's say if North Korea decided to pursue the development of a low-yield nuclear weapon, it would need to probably conduct further testing. It hasn't done that. And as long as we can keep nuclear testing from occurring, North Korea will probably be stuck with the existing designs that it has and perfecting them. So that's one example of a qualitative advancement. The other is on the ballistic missile side, North Korea could change the kinds of propellants that it uses in its longer range missiles. So most of its missiles now need to be fueled before launch, which is an onerous process that does create some space for the United States and allies to consider preemption. That changes if North Korea perfects larger solid fuel missiles. It already demonstrated much progress in this area in between 2015 and 2017, we saw a North Korean submarine launch missile and a land launched missile use this kind of technology. We haven't seen it yet in an intercontinental range ballistic missile, but one of the risks is if this process does fall apart, that is one of the areas where North Korea is most likely to go with future testing. Other issues to worry about include North Korea potentially pursuing multiple warheads. And I know that might sound a little bit fanciful, but if we can take away one lesson from the technological progress of the North Korean program, is that it's never paid off to bet against their capabilities. As a determined proliferator, the North Koreans have really been able to, over time, acquire the capabilities that they need to deter the threats that they perceive in the region. One more thing that I want to just briefly talk about is that one of the hesitations in the past in talking about arms control with North Korea is the idea that we might concede acceptance of the country's nuclear program. And I think this is a point that's important to address. Yes, North Korea is the only country to have withdrawn from the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, one of the most successful treaties in arms control history, and it is a unique case in that regard. It broke out in 2003, and after that, we all know what happened. It is a nuclear armed state today, and one of the concerns that we'll often hear is that by even mooting the idea of arms control, we create incentives, we create moral hazard for other would-be proliferators to pursue the path. But this is where our focus, and maybe Adam can talk a little bit about this after I finish, is on the sanctions regime. North Korea has not gotten where it did today without enduring severe costs. And in our report, we see the value and the role of sanctions to be actually quite important in working towards this future we perceive with North Korea. In fact, watching sanctions implementation loosen, something that the United Nations panel of experts emphasized in its most recent report, is quite worrying because sanctions are one of the most important and one of the most credible tools of leverage that we have with North Korea. But that's where we need to be smart in how we think about sanctions and how we use them. In fact, without putting sanctions relief on the table to get us the kind of things that we want from North Korea to make Northeast Asia a safer place really is negotiating with one hand tied behind our back. And so that's somewhere that I think really a lot more can be done. And Adam, maybe I'll turn it over to you to tell us a bit about the sanctions relief mechanism that we identify.
Yeah, thanks. So Ankit, I think that's a very well taken point. Part of what the group sort of came to is the belief that if we're not willing to lift sanctions, they're not doing us much good in terms of shaping North Korea's capabilities and its behavior. And so there's a sort of set of proposals and plans in the report that describe how sanctions could be lifted, when, and in exchange for what kinds of steps. And it's a pretty hard-nosed approach in the sense that it requires reciprocal moves from North Korea. It's not as though we sort of turn on the tap and let the sunshine in. But there's a set of procedures about what can be lifted, which sanctions authorities you can offer exemptions from, when you can sort of lift specific categories of sanctions, and so forth. It sort of helps us to spell out what a more sequenced, more flexible sanctions regime would look like. And in part of that, there's a variety of sanctions that, it must be said, should not and cannot be lifted. Those that were applied in relation to North Korea's WMD proliferation and programs, human rights sanctions, sanctions that apply to the regime's elite sort of luxury goods and purchases. There's a sort of a couple of other steps in the report that those sanctions we should not consider lifting, until further down the line, North Korea is willing to take steps to address those measures. But the other big innovation of the report that was developed by Tom Plant and then a handful of sort of other people working collaboratively within the group was this idea of a project management process. So the idea here is that if North Korea is willing to reach a threshold agreement, it permits practically, but also politically, a range of sort of broader activities within North Korea, in which we should recognize that the Trump administration and the U.S. isolation of North Korea has allowed North Korea to isolate its own citizens from the rest of the world. And in fact, it deprives us of leverage in shaping North Korea's evolution and transformation over time. It denies us leverage in addressing North Koreans' human rights abuses. And so this project management process would be essentially a commission that was composed of South Korean, Japanese, US, and perhaps diplomats from other countries that were interested in participating, that came to a shared theory of North Korean transformation that at the baseline would help to break down the preference falsification that exists in North Korean psychology, helps to sort of provide information and convince them of the simple sort of facts of their existence and that their lives and circumstances could be improved. And then at the middle level, the meso level, work to build this crucial middle elite of North Korean citizens, traders, cultural leaders, academics that have an interest and a stake and have built their careers on regional stability. Right, that have built their careers on the need to be able to work with other countries in the region safely and securely and effectively. And so what this project management process would do would be to field proposals from South Korean, potentially Japanese, American, European companies that were interested in doing projects in North Korea and evaluate those projects with respect to a shared set of standards. The first is a set of de minimis criteria. Would they create proliferation risks? Would they contribute to human rights violations? Would they enrich the regime? There are a handful of others. If the answer is no, then the project's rejected. But if the answer is yes, then we need to evaluate that sort of project against this shared theory of North Korean transformation, and then secure any necessary sanctions waivers, and then approach the regime with a sort of contract that says, look, here's some standards that you need to agree to in order for outside companies to do investment with you. You need to ensure that North Korean employees are able to keep the wages that they garner from these projects, or at least a large portion of them, that they are not discriminated against or abused. So, for example, it might require NGO access to the Kyohwaso, the North Korean prisons in that region to ensure that these employees are not abused in retaliation for their participation in these projects. Then there are a range of other potential steps that might be required to make a specific project useful. If it's an IT project, maybe those employees should gain some sort of limited internet access. Maybe there's some projects related to agricultural technology that would be worthwhile if an external country has the standing and the leverage to be able to select women entrepreneurs in agricultural regions, to be able to provide them with education or tools or technologies to sort of increase agricultural output. If all of these standards are met, the TPMP, this project management process, could approve and then administer and monitor that project to ensure that those standards are being met. And really all that's going on in this complex process is to say, between the United States and South Korea, other allies and partners, to make sure that we're all working towards a common purpose, which is the betterment of the North Korean people themselves, and to ensure that different companies in different countries aren't going off on different tracks that might sort of have weaker humanitarian or human rights standards, labor standards, and other sort of aspects. And then the last thing that I would highlight is the group believed very strongly and fervently that humanitarian activity, legitimate humanitarian aid, ought to be provided unconditionally, insofar as it gets to its accepted and intended recipients, that it ought to be insulated from the political pressures of different US and South Korean administrations. Last year, countries only met about 25% of the UN resident coordinator's requests for humanitarian aid. In our view, that just isn't acceptable. It plays into the regime's hands of keeping its population impoverished and suffering, and helps to prevent the evolution of the North Korean regime into a more stable, into a safer and more prosperous country. And so there's a handful of recommendations in the report that relate to creating a dedicated channel for humanitarian aid, ensuring that there aren't just carve-outs in U.S. and international law to permit sanction or to permit humanitarian aid, but to ensure that in fact those groups do not have their activities inhibited or hindered by these sanctions, which they report is now all too often the case. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at those sections and those human rights sections. And then before we move to questions, because that's important to me, Mira, I wanted to sort of check in with you on the state of U.S. alliances in the region. Are they healthy? Would it be costly to them to move toward a policy of managing a nuclear-armed North Korea, or is it actually necessary for those alliances?
Yeah, so this was another important insight that I think the group shared quite holistically, and that is the fact that this sort of absolutist objective of full North Korean nuclear disarmament has actually begun to cause real problems for alliances in East Asia, and in particular the US-ROK alliance and the US-Japan alliance. I think we need only look at the state of both of those bilateral alliances right now, as well as trilateral cooperation amongst the three of them, to realize that over the course of the last 2 years, both expectations and priorities of the leaders of all three countries have diverged significantly. The Trump administration has, of course, stuck to a line where it continues to call for complete disarmament from North Korea. President Moon, in contrast, is much more focused on inter-Korean dialogue, of course, and while happy to keep denuclearization as a long-term goal, is very interested in achieving shorter-term gains, and in particular for the Korean people. And Prime Minister Abe of Japan actually has a definition of North Korea's disarmament that is more all-encompassing than the Trump administration's definition. That is to say, to include its chemical and biological weapons programs as well as its delivery capabilities. So you have these three allies whose both capabilities and political will together are formidable, but unfortunately are on three different pages of what their objectives should be with respect to North Korea. And it follows that their pursuits for reaching those objectives will therefore be different. We've seen the costs stack up over the last couple of years. Those include the simple fact that the trilateral cooperation between the three countries is just not nearly as robust as it should be, despite the circumstances obviously warranting it. We've seen situations in which at least one of the parties is very much not in the loop about the progress of diplomatic relations at any given time. And we've also seen more stalling in technical progress around things like intelligence sharing. So it was the view of the group very much actually that thinking about this more limited but much more achievable set of objectives is actually a vitally important thing to do to get our allies back on the same page, moving in lockstep with one another again and moving towards threshold agreements, arms control agreements that can actually be attained. But the assumption is not that arms control alone is going to do the trick. The report very much acknowledges and thinks through what the requirements of deterrence are likely to look like in a region where North Korea retains nuclear weapons for the foreseeable future. And we agreed that currently our alliances are not quite as up to snuff as they should be in a number of areas. Just as Adam and Ankit have talked about the incredibly quick nuclear technical developments that we've seen on the North Korean side, so too have we seen major innovations in North Korean conventional capabilities, and the United States and its allies have marching orders for them in this report that are with regard to improving their own conventional capabilities and ability to respond. North Korea has also rapidly become one of the leading users of cyber capabilities, of cyber weapons, cyber attacks in the world. And the United States and its allies are not adequately prepared to respond. They should certainly have some kind of cyber intelligence sharing network amongst them and be coordinating their defensive responses. So in addition to believing that this set of more realistic objectives is necessary to synchronizing alliance policies and getting our alliances back on track, we also do realize that stability and arms control have their limits, that a world in which North Korea retains nuclear weapons is a world in which there are dangers, and we see our alliances as the critical tool for being able to establish deterrence at all levels, arguing in this report, as we do, that the United States and its allies should retain dominance at every level of significant possible escalation with North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
Please, question.
Just two final things before we break for questions. So one thing is that at the end of everything that we've been discussing, the time frame that we were working with for the assumption of North Korea possessing nuclear weapons was 2 or 3 decades, because that's honestly the time that we think that North Korea will likely retain its capabilities. And if we're very lucky, what we envision at the end of that process is actually the same goal that the Allied governments envision today, which is the return of North Korea to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in good standing as a non-nuclear weapons state. So that's just something I wanted to underscore, because I think that's an important component of the recommendations that we have. And the second thing is we haven't really talked about Russia and China, and I think they're a very important picture of a part of this picture. Especially with what we have said about sanctions, a lot of that does rely on Russian and Chinese implementation. And of course, as I briefly mentioned, the panel of experts has already found that the maximum pressure campaign has effectively had a lot of the air let out of it since this bout of diplomacy began. And also, more seriously, Russia and China are beginning to more explicitly support sanctions relief for North Korea, perhaps not of the kind that was asked for in Hanoi at the most recent summit, but there was a trilateral statement last November with Choi Sun-hee, the North Korean vice foreign minister, and her Russian and Chinese counterparts supporting the idea of North Korea beginning to receive some kind of sanctions relief. And the longer this goes on, the less likely the United States, South Korea, and Japan will be to really take the lead on using the existing sanctions to elicit the kind of things that are important for Allied security. So that's just something I want to underscore with the role of Russia and China.
So with that, I thank you so much for attending, and look forward to talking to you one-on-one afterward.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Mira. Thank you, Ankit. Before we wrap up, thank you all for coming. Thank you for articulating your vision of the report and for engaging with our audience. I think that there's lots of questions and lots of debate and lots of thinking yet to come. So thank you very much. Please join us for our future events at the Korea Society next week. On Wednesday, we have General Vincent Brooks, former General Vincent Brooks, and former General Walter Skip Sharp, both former CFC generals, talking Wednesday at 12 o'clock. Please sign up for that event. We encourage you to sign up as members and please support the Korea Society. Our membership starts at just $75 and supports programs like this one. Thank you so much for coming. Hang out with us a little bit, chat, help us finish the food and the drinks. And one last time, please help me to thank our speakers today, Adam, Mira, and Ankit.